The electronic wail wasn't a warning. It was a death sentence. A sharp, insistent beep, beep, beep shredded the comfortable hum of the F-15E Strike Eagle's cockpit. Captain Ava Reaper, Rostova's eyes snapped from her navigational display to the threat warning panel. Her blood ran cold. In the front seat, Major Lena Viking Croft felt the subtle shift in her backseater's posture. A silent alarm transmitted through the airframe itself. "Viking, I've got a spike." Eva's voice was tight, a controlled blade of sound. "SA-17 Grizzly, bearing 270. It's a lock." Lena's hands, encased in her flight gloves, tightened on the control stick. Her knuckles pressed white against the leather. An SA-17, not some rusty, dumb-fired relic. This was a modern track-via missile system, a truck-mounted battery that could engage multiple targets at once, and they had flown right into its kill zone. The serene blue of the sky outside the canopy suddenly felt like a vast, treacherous trap. "Copy, Reaper. Deploying countermeasures." Lena's voice was a practiced monotone, a stark contrast to the adrenaline screaming through her veins. Her left hand danced across the countermeasures panel, her movements precise, almost graceful under the looming threat. "Judy, programming evasive maneuver Bravo 9er. Behind her, Eva's mind was a whirlwind of calculations. Altitude, 32,000 feet. Airspeed, 600 knots. The terrain below was a jagged tapestry of deep green valleys and brutal gray mountain peaks. There was no friendly cover for 100 miles. They were alone. A blossom of chaff and flares erupted from the belly of the jet. A desperate, beautiful cloud of metallic confetti and fire meant to seduce the incoming missile. Lena didn't wait to see if it worked. She slammed the twin throttles forward and pulled the stick hard to the right. Throwing the massive fighter into a violent, gut-wrenching dive, the G-force was an immense, living weight, crushing them into their seats, pressing the breath from their lungs. The straps of their harnesses dug into their shoulders. The world outside the canopy became a nauseating blur of spinning earth and dizzying sky. "Missile in the air!" Eva called out. Her voice strained against the G's. "Time to impact, 15 seconds. Lane held the dive, her eyes glued to her display, then flicking up to the real world. She was flying on instinct now, on years of muscle memory carved into her hands. 10 seconds. She could feel the missile, a predator homing in on its prey. 5 seconds. A sliver of fire and metal streaked past their starboard side, so close the turbulence rocked the jet. It had missed. The chaff had worked. For a moment, the cockpit was filled with nothing but the sound of their own ragged breathing and the roar of the engines. The relief was a physical thing, a fleeting cold wave, but it lasted only a second. "Viking," Ava's voice cut through the momentary calm, sharper and more urgent than before. "Second launch." "Second launch. Same battery. It's faster." "It's guiding." Lena's heart hammered against her ribs. She scanned the terrain below, her mind racing for an exit. A trick, a miracle. The mountains were too steep to dive behind. Their countermeasures were depleted. The missile was faster, smarter, and it was coming. They were trapped in a valley with a hunter that would not miss twice. The electronic wail filled the cockpit once more, a relentless, screaming dirge. There was no escape. The crushing G-force of the dive pressed Lena's cheeks back, stretching her skin tight against her skull. Her helmet felt like it weighed 100 pounds. In the violent, shuddering chaos of the evasive maneuver, her mind did not go to the manuals or to the training. It went to a photograph. It was a black-and-white image, faded at the corners, tucked into the corner of her locker back at Incirlik. A 10-year-old Lena, her hair in messy pigtails, sat perched on the broad shoulders of a man in a crisp Air Force service dress uniform. Her small hands were wrapped around his forehead, and they were both laughing, caught in a moment of pure, unburdened joy. Her father, Colonel James Croft, a man who had flown F-4 Phantoms along the icy edges of Soviet airspace during the coldest days of the Cold War. He never spoke of the fear. He spoke of the sky. He spoke of the weight of the wings, the solemn trust between a pilot and her aircraft, the unbreakable bond between a front-seater and her back-seater. "Courage, Lenny," he'd told her once, his voice soft but firm, "is not the absence of fear. It is the judgment that something else is more important than that fear. Right now, The fear was a living thing, a cold serpent coiling in her gut. But something else was infinitely more important. It was the life of the woman behind her. It was the steady, if strained, breathing she could hear over the intercom. It was Eva. The memory of her father's voice was a ghost in the cockpit, a sudden, startling clarity. He had faced his own MiGs, his own moments of no return. He had chosen to turn and fight. The legacy was not just in the stories, but in the blood. It was in her hands, on this stick, right now. "Eva," Lena said, her voice low, the call sign feeling foreign and wrong in this moment. She took a sharp breath, the oxygen from her mask tasting of rubber and metal. "Status." "Missile is tracking true," Eva responded, her voice a focused monotone, a stark contrast to the screaming threat warning. "Countermeasures are 0. We are not clearing the engagement zone. The valley is boxing us in." A beat of static-filled silence, heavy with the unspoken truth. They were out of options. They were out of sky. Lena's eyes swept the instruments, then the unforgiving landscape through the canopy. The peaks were too close, the walls of the valley a prison. The missile's trajectory was a line of certain death on her display. Running was a delayed execution. The only direction left was the one they had come from. "Eva," Lena said again, but this time her voice was different. It was calm. It was final. It was the voice of a decision made. She used her name, the real one, stripping away the call sign, the rank, the armor. "We're not going to make it." The words hung in the air, not as a surrender, but as a stark assessment. A foundation upon which to build a last desperate stand. In the rear cockpit, Eva Rostova heard the shift. She heard the calm. She heard her name. And in that single, suspended second, she understood everything. The training, the protocols, the instinct to flee, it was all gone. What remained was the raw human core of the mission. It was her and it was Lena. "Then we turn and fight," Eva said. Her voice was steady now, all trace of strain gone. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an affirmation, a pact sealed in the certain terror of their situation. It was the only choice that offered a sliver of honor, a chance to strike back at the thing that was about to kill them. A grim, hard smile touched Lena's lips, unseen behind her oxygen mask. It was the same feeling her father must have known. That judgment, that something else, duty, partnership, defiance, was more important than the fear. Her hands, which had been tight with tension, relaxed into a firm, deliberate grip on the controls. The course was set. The die was cast. They would face the threat head-on. The moment the pact was sealed, the world narrowed. The screaming alarm, the shuddering airframe, the terrifying reality of the incoming missile, it all faded into a dull roar at the back of Lena's mind. Her focus became absolute, her vision tunneling onto the instruments and the feel of the jet as if it were an extension of her own body. "Initiate combat turn," Lena stated, her voice devoid of all emotion, save for a cold, determined clarity. "Feeding you targeting data now," Eva responded instantly, her fingers a blur across her screens, her world collapsing into vectors, ranges, and the glowing icon of the SAM site. Lena hauled back on the control stick with a steady, immense pressure. The G-force returned, not as a shocking blow this time, but as a familiar, crushing embrace. She fought against it, grunting as she forced her body to endure, to stay conscious, to perform. The horizon, which had been a tilted line outside the canopy, began to spin violently. The earth and sky traded places in a dizzying cartwheel. For a heart-stopping second, they were inverted, the jagged peaks of the valley floor looming terrifyingly close above their heads. Then Lena completed the roll, and the world righted itself. They were now flying directly back the way they had come. The nose of the F-15 was pointed like a vengeful spear toward the source of the radar emissions painting their skin. It was a tactical insanity, a head-on charge against a modern air defense system. The crew on the ground would be celebrating, thinking they had scared the jet away. They would be reloading, confident in their victory. They would never expect the prey to become the hunter. Switching to air-to-ground gun mode, Eva confirmed, her voice tight with concentration. Their air-to-ground missiles were useless at this close, merging range. This would be a knife fight, a single high-speed pass with the 20mm cannon. There would be no second chance. "Target is painting us again," Eva called out. "They've seen us!" Almost immediately, new threats erupted. Lazy, arcing lines of green tracer fire began to stitch the sky around them. The battery's secondary defense, a ZSU-23-4 anti-aircraft gun, had opened up. The world outside the canopy became a lethal garden of blooming flak. "Steady, steady," Eva whispered, her eyes locked on the targeting display, her right hand hovering over the trigger for the Vulcan cannon. The Pipper, the targeting reticle, danced erratically over the terrain map on her screen. She was waiting for the precise moment, the fleeting window where their flight path and the target would intersect. Lena held the jet as steady as a rock in a hurricane. She ignored the tracers, the proximity of the ground, the certain knowledge that a single 23mm shell could shred their hydraulics, their engines, their lives. She trusted Eva with everything. Her life was in the hands of the woman in the back seat, just as Eva's life was in hers. This was the partnership, the sacred trust her father had spoken of. It was no longer an abstract concept. It was the only thing that mattered. "They're tracking us," Eva said, her voice calm but urgent. "I need 5 more seconds of stable flight." Lena didn't respond. She just held the stick, her arms aching, her body screaming under the relentless G-force. She became a statue at the heart of the storm, her will the only thing keeping the massive fighter on its suicidal course. The SAM site grew larger in her mind's eye, a fixed point of hatred and danger they were hurling themselves toward. There was no fear anymore. There was only the run, the gun, the fight. The world dissolved into a screaming, shuddering nightmare of green tracers and violent turbulence. The ZSU's fire intensified, creating a lethal latticework in the sky they had to fly through. Lena's entire universe was the feel of the stick in her hands, the strain in her muscles fighting the G-forces, and the unwavering trust she placed in the woman behind her. Every instinct screamed at her to jink, to evade, to break the deadly rhythm of their attack run. She silenced them all. She was the rock. She was the steady platform. In the back seat, Eva's world was a digital hellscape of data. The glowing green icon of the SAM site pulsed on her screen, the targeting Pipper dancing around it. The jet's violent vibrations made the image blur. She was calculating closure rate, altitude decay, and bullet drop in her head, her training taking over completely. Come on," she muttered, her thumb resting on the red trigger button. She needed a perfect solution. "They would get one shot, one! Reaper, I need it now!" Lena's voice was a sharp crackle over the intercom, strained from the physical effort of holding the jet steady. A stream of 23mm shells ripped past the canopy, so close she felt the concussive thump in her chest. The Pipper settled. It was now or never. "Guns, guns, guns!" Eva yelled, the formal call a release of pure, focused fury. She squeezed the trigger. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then the entire aircraft shuddered with a deep, rhythmic and deafening roar. Brrrt! The 6-barrel M61 Vulcan cannon in the nose of the F-15 erupted, spitting out 20mm shells at a rate of 6,000 rounds per minute. A solid stream of fire and steel reached out from their jet, a vengeful finger of God tracing a line across the landscape below. Eva held the trigger, her eyes glued to the screen. Walking it in. She made micro-adjustments, guiding the torrent of destruction. The line of impacting shells, visible even from their altitude, stitched across the dirt, chewing up the earth, then walked directly into the parked missile transporter erector vehicle. The results were instantaneous and catastrophic. The high-explosive incendiary shells tore into the vehicle's fuel and munitions. A brilliant, blinding white flash was followed by a secondary explosion that bloomed into a massive, roiling fireball of orange and black. The shockwave hit them a second later, a palpable thump that rattled the airframe. "Target destroyed!" Eva shouted, her voice raw with a mixture of triumph and shock. The SAM site was gone, erased from the map in a storm of steel and fire. Lena didn't celebrate. She didn't even acknowledge it. The moment the gun run was over, she slammed the throttles forward and pulled back on the stick, commanding the heavy jet into a steep, climbing turn away from the inferno. The G-force returned, pressing them down, but this time it felt different. It was the G-force of escape, of survival. The sky around them was suddenly, eerily quiet. The radar warning receiver fell silent. The tracers had stopped. The only sound was the roar of their own engines and the heavy, ragged sound of their own breathing. They had done it. They had turned a certain death into an impossible victory. They had flown into the heart of the danger and torn it out. The valley was no longer a trap. It was a testament. Lena finally allowed herself a single sharp exhale, a puff of air that fogged the inside of her oxygen mask for a second. They were alive. The silence was the most profound sound Lena had ever heard. It was a heavy, tangible thing, broken only by the steady roar of the twin engines and the frantic hammering of her own heart. The threat warning panel was dark. The sky was empty. Below, a thick black plume of smoke rose from the valley, a funeral shroud for the SAM site. She kept the jet in a hard climb, putting distance between them and the valley of death, her eyes constantly scanning the sky for any new threats, her body still thrumming with adrenaline. In the back seat, Ava let out a long, slow breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Her hands were trembling slightly as they rested on her console. The digital screens that had been a maelstrom of targeting data and threat warnings now showed calm, green navigation symbols. The transition from violent combat to serene flight was jarring, almost dreamlike. She looked down at her right hand, the one that had squeezed the trigger, and flexed her fingers. It felt alien, as if it belonged to someone else. "Viking," Eva said, her voice hoarse. "Systems are clean. No further threats. We are clear." Lena gave a sharp single nod, a gesture meant as much for herself as for her WSO. "Copy, Reaper." She finally allowed her grip on the control stick to relax a fraction. The tension in her shoulders began to ebb, replaced by a deep, bone-weary fatigue. She keyed the mic for the long-range radio, her voice returning to the cool, professional monotone of a mission pilot. "Kodiak Base, this is Viking 7-1. Mission update. We have engaged and neutralized a hostile SA-17 battery in the Zavros Valley. Aircraft is intact. Proceeding to egress point Alpha." The controller's voice, when it came back, was laced with disbelief and relief. "Copy that, Viking 7-1. Say again, neutralized? Confirm you engaged a surface-to-air battery." "Confirmed, Kodiak," Lena said, a flicker of grim satisfaction cutting through the fatigue. "We engage with guns. The site is destroyed." A long pause stretched over the radio wave. "Roger, Viking 7-1. Your signal is clear. Welcome back." The formalities done, the reality of what they had just accomplished began to settle in the cockpit. It wasn't a feeling of glory or triumph. It was something quieter, heavier. They had stared into the abyss, and instead of flinching, they had spit into it. They had made a choice that defied all standard procedure, a choice born of pure survival instinct and a shared, unbreakable will. Lena leveled the jet off at a safer altitude, the sun glinting off the canopy. She risked a glance over her shoulder, but could only see the top of Eva's helmet. "Ava," she said, the name feeling natural now. That was the best damn gun run I've ever seen." From the back seat, Eva managed a weak, breathy laugh. It was a sound stripped of all humor, filled only with the stark relief of being alive. "You held it steady, Lena. You held it perfectly. I pulled the trigger." She paused, the image of the fireball seared into her memory. "My God, we actually did it." They flew on in silence for a few minutes, each woman alone with her thoughts, yet profoundly connected. The shared experience had forged a bond deeper than any mission briefing ever could. They had passed through the fire together. Lena's mind drifted back to the black and white photograph, to her father's laughing face. She understood him now in a way she never had before. It wasn't about the medals or the stories. It was about this quiet, exhausted, shared understanding in the cockpit after cheating death. It was about the person in the other seat. It was about turning and fighting and living to tell the tale. The jet flew on, a silver arrow in the vast blue, carrying its two pilots home. The thrum of the engines was a soothing balm after the deafening roar of the cannon. The familiar procedures of the return flight began to calm their frayed nerves. Checklists were completed, systems were monitored, but a heavy, contemplative silence had settled between them. It was a silence filled with the unspoken magnitude of what they had just done. The adrenaline was receding, leaving behind a hollow, shaky feeling in its wake. Lena focused on the horizon, the endless blue, a stark contrast to the violent green of the valley. She could still feel the ghost of the G-forces in her muscles, a deep, pleasant ache that was a testament to their survival. Her eyes kept drifting to the fuel gauge, the altimeter, any concrete number that could anchor her in this new, peaceful reality. She was compartmentalizing, pushing the memory of the missile lock and the tracers into a box to be examined later, in the quiet of her quarters, far from this cockpit. In the back, Eva's mind was replaying the events on a relentless loop. The screaming alarm, the gut-wrenching dive, the terrifying realization that there was no escape. Then the calm, decisive tone in Lena's voice when she said her name. "We're not going to make it." Those words should have been a sentence of doom. Instead, they had been a catalyst. They had forged a diamond-hard resolve out of their shared fear. She looked at the back of Lena's helmet, at the familiar patches sewn onto the flight suit. This woman had held the jet steady through a storm of steel, trusting her completely. It was a debt that could never be repaid, only honored. "Lena," Eva said softly, breaking the long silence. "Back there? When you said we weren't going to make it?" She trailed off, searching for the right words. Lena didn't turn. She kept her eyes forward, but her posture shifted slightly, listening. "I know," she replied, her voice quiet. "It was the only truth we had left. Everything else was a lie." "It was what I needed to hear," Eva said, her voice gaining strength. It cut through the noise. "It made the choice simple." She paused, the image of the fireball flashing behind her eyes. "We turned and fought." A faint, tired smile touched Lena's lips, hidden behind her mask. "We did, just like the old man taught me." "The Cold War pilot?" "Yeah," Lena said, a warmth entering her voice for the first time. "He always said the sky doesn't reward the timid." He would have approved of that pass, Eva. He would have approved of you." The compliment landed with a profound weight. Eva felt a surge of emotion, a tightness in her throat that had nothing to do with G-forces. It was recognition of the purest kind, not from a general, not from a command, but from a fellow pilot, from the daughter of a legend, who had just shared the most defining moment of her life. The coastline appeared on the horizon, a thin, brown line separating the deep blue of the sea from the pale blue of the sky. Home. The sight was more beautiful than any postcard. Lena began the gradual descent, the routines of landing now taking over. The gear was lowered with a solid, reassuring thud. The flaps extended. The world outside slowed down. As the wheels touched down with a shriek of rubber and a puff of smoke, the finality of it all washed over them. They were back. The mission was over. They had left as two officers on a routine flight. They were returning as something else entirely. The jet rolled down the runway, its speed bleeding away, carrying them back to a world that had no idea how close it had come to losing them, nor how fiercely they had fought to return to it. The engines whined down to a low hum, and then silence. True silence. They had made it. The shriek of the tires kissing the tarmac was the most beautiful sound Lena had ever heard. It was the sound of life, of a future, of a promise kept. She guided the massive fighter off the runway and onto the taxiway, the ground crew marshalling them in with glowing wands. The familiar sights of the base, the hangars, the fuel trucks, the other aircraft, looked different now. They were sharper, more vivid, as if she were seeing them for the first time. The adrenaline was gone, leaving a profound humming exhaustion in its place. She followed the marshaller's signals, turning the jet into its designated hard stand. As she eased the throttles back to cutoff, the roar of the engines faded into a whine, then into a series of clicks and pings as the metal began to cool. The sudden absolute quiet was deafening. For a long moment, neither woman moved. They simply sat in the sudden stillness, listening to the sound of their own breathing, the residual hum of electronics, the distant sound of a truck engine. The cockpit, which had been a chamber of terror and then a vessel of vengeance, was now just a small, quiet room. Lena slowly reached up and unclipped her oxygen mask. letting it hang loose. She pulled off her helmet, running a hand through her damp, flattened hair. The cool air of the cockpit felt like a blessing on her skin. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the air tasting of rubber and sweat and jet fuel. It was the taste of survival. Behind her, Ava was going through the same ritual. The release of the helmet, the unclipping of the mask. She flexed her shoulders, feeling the stiffness from being strapped in so tightly for so long. Her mind was a blank slate, wiped clean by the sheer intensity of the experience. There were no thoughts, only sensations. The cool air, the feel of her flight suit against her skin, the profound, bone-deep knowledge that she was alive. Lena unstrapped herself and pushed the canopy open. The hydraulic hiss was loud in the silence. The outside air washed in, carrying the distinct oily scent of the flight line. She stood up in her seat, her legs feeling weak and unsteady, as if she had just stepped off a ship after a long voyage. She turned and looked into the back cockpit. Eva was looking up at her, her face pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and dawning relief. There were no words. None were needed. Lena reached a hand down. Eva took it, her grip firm, almost desperate. It was more than a helping hand. It was a connection, a confirmation that they had both made it through, together. Eva climbed out of the back seat, her movements slow, deliberate. She stood on the wing root next to Lena, and for a moment they just looked at each other. The ground crew was already swarming around the jet, their eyes wide as they took in the scorch marks and the distinct smell of cordite that clung to the airframe. A crew chief pointed to a series of fresh, jagged scratches along the fuselage near the tail. Too close. Far too close. Lena's eyes met Eva's again, and a slow, weary, but genuine smile spread across her face. Ava returned it, a shaky, emotional smile that reached her eyes. They had not just survived. They had triumphed. They had been given no escape, and so they had turned and they had fought, and they had won. The proof was beneath their feet, in the solid, tangible reality of the jet, and in the firm, living grip of each other's hand. They stood there on the wing, two pilots against the vast sky, silent partners in a story few would ever believe. The silence on the wing was broken by the approaching sound of a utility truck and the distant wail of an ambulance, a standard precaution they were grateful to ignore. The crew chief, a grizzled master sergeant with a face like worn leather, looked from the fresh scars on the fuselage to the two pilots still standing motionless. His eyes, sharp and knowing, held a respect that went beyond rank. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was all the debrief they needed in that moment. They climbed down the ladder, their flight boots hitting the tarmac with a solid, grounding thud. The earth felt strangely still, unnervingly solid after the violent motions of the sky. A debriefing officer approached, his clipboard in hand, but Lena simply held up a single finger, a quiet but firm request for a moment. The officer, understanding the look in her eyes, stopped and gave them space. Lena and Ava walked away from the jet, away from the small crowd, their steps slow and synchronized. They stopped 100 feet away, standing in the shadow of a large hangar. The late afternoon sun cast long, deep shadows across the concrete. Lena finally turned to face Eva fully. "You know," Lena began, her voice rough but calm. "They're going to write reports. They're going to call it a tactical engagement. They'll probably give us a medal." Eva let out a soft, breathy sound that was almost a laugh. "They can keep the medal," Lena nodded in agreement. It wasn't about that. It was about... She trailed off, searching for the word. "The choice," Eva finished for her. "When there was no choice left to make, we made our own." She looked back at their aircraft, the warhorse that had carried them through hell and back. We turned. A comfortable silence settled between them, filled with the distant sounds of the base. The memory of the fear was still there, a cold stone in their guts, but it was now overshadowed by something warmer, something unbreakable. They had looked into the abyss together, and they had not blinked. The bond forged in that cockpit was stronger than any alloy in the jet behind them. Lena reached into a pocket on her flight suit and pulled out a small, worn leather wallet. She opened it, not to show Eva, but for herself. Tucked inside was the black and white photograph of her and her father. She looked at his laughing face, at the young, carefree girl she had been. For the first time, she felt she truly understood the weight he had carried, the quiet burden of command and the sacredness of the trust placed in a wingman. She wasn't just his daughter anymore. She was part of his legacy, a keeper of the same flame. She looked up at Ava, her partner. "My father used to say that you don't really know someone until you've flown with them, until your life is in their hands and theirs in yours." She paused, her gaze steady. "I know you, Eva Rostova, and I would fly with you anywhere." Eva felt a surge of emotion, a prickle at the corners of her eyes that she quickly willed away. The formal recognition, the medals, the reports, it was all just noise. This, from Lena Croft, was everything. It was the only recognition that mattered. "Likewise, Lena," Eva said, her voice thick with feeling. "Anywhere." They stood there for a long moment, two women bound by an experience that would forever define them. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The mission was over. The fight was won. But as they turned together and began the slow walk toward the debriefing room, side by side, they knew this was not an end. It was a beginning. They had learned the most valuable lesson a pilot could ever learn. That when faced with no escape, the human spirit doesn't break. It turns, and it fights. And in the doing, it soars.